convert a third, deport a third, and murder a third. This was the policy of the Ustasha in dealing with the Serbs within their borders. The Ustasha was the name given to the fascist movement that aimed to create an independent Croatia in Yugoslavia. When the Axis powers of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy invaded the region, the Ustasha set about ridding the area of Jews, Serbs and Roma in a bid to build a pure Croat state. The levels of violence employed by the Ustasha would be so extreme that it even shocked their Nazi and Italian allies. It is estimated that anywhere between 200,000 and 500,000 people were murdered in the most brutal of ways, with horrors including setting up concentration and death camps that only housed children, and much of the killing done with hand tools. In today's video, we will look at the reasons behind such a barbaric group forming, and the crimes they committed, and the consequences for the region. It's helpful to start with the formation of Yugoslavia. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes was formed in 1918 following the First World War. Old empires were split up and the map of Europe was redrawn. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes was created with these nationalities forming a new state, from land originally controlled from the defeated Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. No regard was given to just how these varied cultures were going to work together in the new state. There were many different religions, such as Islam, Orthodox Christianity, and Catholicism, and many more nationalities. Each of these nationalities were all pushing for self-determination, but this was largely ignored. Serbs would play a leading role in the newly formed state, as they were both the largest of the ethnic groups and had fought on the side of the victorious Allied powers, whereas the conscripted Slavs and Croats fought for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1929, the Serb king Alexander renamed the country the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. He established a dictatorship, abolished the constitution, and dissolved parliament. This resulted in many of the politicians leaving the country in exile. Among them was Ante Pavlović, the man who would go on to create the Ustasha movement. Ustasha, roughly translated, means uprising. The goal was to create an independent Croatia. It was pro-Catholicism and tolerant to the Bosnian Muslims in the region, who they saw as Croats who had converted to Islam under Ottoman rule. It was anti-Serb, anti-Orthodox Christian with desires to annex Serbian territory. Pavlović was clear that the methods to establish an independent Croatia would be through extreme violence. In one speech he proclaimed, "The knife, revolver, machine gun and time bomb. These are the idols. These are the bells that will announce the dawning and the resurrection of the independent state of Croatia." In 1934, Alexander was assassinated in France. The murder was carried out by the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, working alongside the Ustasha, and his son and heir, Peter II, was too young. The kingdom was ruled by war of a regency. Nazi expansion in the region in the 30s encouraged the Kingdom of Yugoslavia to sign the Tripartite Pact on the 25th of March 1941, in a bid to avoid annexation. Shortly after, a British-backed coup removed the regency and placed the now 17-year-old Peter II on the throne. This action only encouraged Nazi Germany to invade Yugoslavia, which fell to their control in a matter of weeks. It was often the case in newly conquered Nazi territories that puppet governments would be installed. Such was the case with Yugoslavia. The country was divided up, with Italy claiming the coast and Montenegro, land in the north claimed by Hungary, and in the east claimed by Bulgaria. The Ustasha were not the first pick for a puppet state, though they were enthusiastic in proving their loyalty to the Axis powers. Though the Axis powers were largely distrustful that the Ustasha would deliver what was required of them. The independent state of Croatia was formed with the Ustasha put in power by their Nazi and Italian patrons. In a bid to elevate their status as the new rulers, the Ustasha attempted to frame their ancestry as Germanic and Gothic, though this was based on fantasy and not grounded in fact. Nazi focus was not on the Balkans, but rather the Soviet Union. At this point in the war, Operation Barbarossa was in full swing. So as long as the Balkans were under control, much could be tolerated by the Axis powers. For Pavlović, the cost of annexed land and the Axis supervision was well worth Croatian independence and domination over those seen as inferior. On the 22nd of July 1941, the Ustasha government issued their racial policies, decreeing those who would be targeted in a series of deportation, forced conversions, and massacres. The key targets were the Serbs, Jews, and Roma peoples living within the new Croatian state. The massacres of the Serbs by the Ustasha forces started as early as 1941 in a small village called Godović. Around 200 Serbs were killed by firing squad by the Ustasha militia, responsible for much of the killings to come. It was not simply enough for the Ustasha to murder Serbs. Widespread reports detailed the level of mutilation employed. Very often, eyes would be gouged out, ears and noses removed, and items inserted into sexual organs, and bodies would be left for wild pigs to eat or to rot away. A series of concentration camps were established, notably at Jasenovac. Nazi influence resulted in a series of laws stripping Jews and Roma of rights and property. However, in the case of Jews, they would be able to avoid persecution if they converted and gave up their religion. The Ustasha's main target would always be the Serbs. A proclamation was issued that the policy of the Ustasha was to kill a third of Serbs, deport a third, and forcefully convert a third to Catholicism. Serbs formed the majority of prisoners in Jasenovac, mainly those who refused to convert to Catholicism. Food would be sparse, either a starch or turnip soup, supplemented with whatever the prisoners would be able to scavenge. This would include leaves, grass, or whatever undigested food could be found in human waste. Prisoners would be made to work in the fields for agriculture, in the brickworks, or in metalworking, often making weapons for the Ustasha. Those who did not perish as a result of the horrendous conditions and disease would be systematically murdered. Whilst attempts to gas prisoners were made with gas fans similar to those used by the Nazis, there were no gas chambers at Jasenovac. Those who were murdered were done so manually. Often this was done with a blow to the head and the bodies then dumped in the nearby rivers, so that the corpses would drift up and end in Serbian territory. Sometimes, contests were held as to which guard would be able to kill the most prisoners. One winner of such a contest was Peter Bratsica, who was reported to have personally killed between 1,100 and 1,300 people, and the weapon used by Bratsica and many of the guards was a Serb Cutter. This was an agriculture knife attached to a leather band worn on the hand. This would enable the guards to slit the throats or viciously stab the back of the head with great speed and with only minimum risk of injury to the wielder. Bodies that were not thrown into the river would be buried in mass graves, dug by a select group of prisoners. Many of these gravediggers would also be forced to take part in the killings. One of the darkest and most distressing of concentration camps was at Sisak, which had a separate camp for children. Thousands of children, often alone, though occasionally with their mothers, would be interned in the direst of conditions. The camp held more than 6,000 Serbian, Jewish, and Roma children, aged between 3 and 16, and they were kept in old stables. Dysentery combined with a diet of gruel resulted in an estimated 1,500 children dead. Murders were routinely carried out by the guards, often by taking a child and smashing them against a wall. One survivor of the camp was Bozo Judas. He was able to survive only as he was adopted by a local couple looking for a girl. Due to the poor conditions, Judas scavenged a dress that he would wear, and as all children were in a poor state, it was often not possible to tell the girls apart from the boys. According to Judas, the children were dirty, soiled, and full of threadworms. When my future adoptive father came to the camp looking for a girl, I was near the entrance. Somehow, children sensed that the person who had come had good intentions. I held him by the legs and refused to release him. As I was in a dress, he thought I was a girl and he took me in. His new family soon realized he was not a girl, but could not bring themselves to return him to the awful conditions of the camp. Unfortunately, Judas's younger sister remained in the camp and was never seen again. All the while, there were two major forms of opposition to the Ustasha, the Checknicks and the partisans. The Checknicks were the remnants of the royalist armed forces who attempted to fight and protect as many as they could in the name of Serbian nationalism. And the partisans were communist-backed guerrillas who gained massive support from the population and fought against the Axis and Ustasha occupying forces. Largely regarded as the most successful of the anti-Axis partisan groups. At times, the Ustasha and Checknicks would collaborate against the partisans, the Checknicks seeing the communists as a bigger threat than the genocide raging around them. We will not go into too much detail on the resistance movements, as they deserve videos on their own, but I would strongly recommend you to take the time to look into these groups and the competing aims of each. What is important to note is that the barbarity of the Ustasha was able to galvanize support of the partisans against the fascists. In a report to Heinrich Himmler, it was stated, "Increased activity of the partisans is chiefly due to the atrocities carried out by Ustasha units in Croatia against the Orthodox population. The Ustasha committed their deeds in a bestial manner, not only against males of conscript age, but especially against helpless old people, women and children. The number of the Orthodox that the Croats have massacred and sadistically tortured to death is about 300,000. Following the surrender of fascist Italy and as the areas under German control shrank, the partisans were able to make territorial gains. The Ustasha fought to retreat to Austria, attempting to escape partisan and Soviet capture. On the 21st of April 1945, with the partisans fast approaching, the Ustasha murdered the remaining prisoners that were still at Jasenovac. On the 22nd of April, around 600 inmates attempted a revolt, but of those, only 90 managed to escape, and all the rest were murdered. On the day of the revolt, the Ustasha killed the 400 remaining prisoners who chose not to try to escape. The buildings, guardhouses and torture rooms were all put to the flame, leaving only ruins and the remains of countless victims. It is estimated that around 40,000 Ustasha captives were rounded up and gunned down by the partisans. Pavelić instead would make his way to Rome, and with help of the Vatican, was able to hide for a number of years in some of their properties. In 1948, he fled to Argentina along with around 30,000 of the Ustasha members under the protection of Juan Perón. In 1957, an attempted assassination left Pavelić with crippling wounds. Following the fall of Perón, Pavelić fled to Spain, where he would die a slow death of his wounds in December of 1959, never facing justice for his litany of crimes. Even to this day, there are those who seek to deny the crimes of the Ustasha. Phrases and iconography are still chanted and displayed, with some attempting to deny the genocide altogether. Some believe that the successful creation of an independent Croatia justifies the denial of the genocide. It is important to remember that the goal of the Axis powers was to create a stable Balkans that would not impact the push east and the war with the Soviet Union. As stated in the Gestapo memo, the very crimes of the Ustasha were creating and entrenching the partisan resistance. It should also be remembered that the reason the Nazis abandoned the personal massacres committed by the Einsatzgruppen was due to the psychological toll this had on the men carrying them out. The fact that this was not a problem for the Ustasha speaks to the deranged and twisted mentality of those involved. Following the Second World War, a new Yugoslavia was formed, headed by the leader of the partisans, Tito. Throughout his rule, the various ethnic and religious groups lived in a relative peace, albeit under an oppressive communist regime. though one not under the thumb of the Soviet Union that managed to remain neutral during the Cold War. Following the death of Tito, the region would once again be plunged into further genocides and armed conflicts during the Bosnian War, the horrors of which will be covered in another video. The crimes of the Ustasha highlight the dangers of those who push for a pure state, whether along religious, racial, or nationalist lines. Racial and religious oppression were the tools to create their desired state was brutal violence. It is important to note that the Ustasha never had the widespread support of the Croat people. The power of the Ustasha came from their Nazi patrons, who through the use of such puppet states were able to subjugate much of Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews and Roma were massacred in a bid to create a pure Croatia, and to appease their Axis backers. It is generally accepted that around 300,000 people were murdered by the Ustasha. However, some estimates are as high as 700,000 massacred. We must never forget the crimes of the Ustasha, and must push back against those attempting to deny their victims. At the time, the world was at war with multiple fronts engaged. The Ustasha were able to get away with so much violence as the rest of the world was preoccupied. Today, we remember those who were massacred in the Holocaust, but so too must we remember those who were massacred by the allies of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy.